one of the most interesting things about being a part of TLEC and even building TLEC. It's one of the things that I think keeps me going, really, is just finding out about you, about the audience, about the community, and hearing what your journey has been like. I have literally been through like thousands of L&D professionals just with the live conferences I've done and just throughout my career in this space. And it's the thing that keeps me the most fascinated and curious is just how did you guys get here? So, so story for this community day is totally, on target for me. And I hope that you guys enjoy community day. And then Theresa reached out because I think it was Erin Peterschick. She had, you're friends with her and she sent you my way. And so here we are, another story expert, and we can kind of get started with community day a little early. So,
yes, absolutely.
Really fascinated. I looked at your website. It's whystoryworks.com if anybody's interested in checking that out. You also have a great YouTube channel with some really, really interesting things, and your background is really fascinating. You were a performer, worked for a nonprofit, a variety of stories there, I'm sure. So, why don't we just get into it? And I'm gonna, I have a series of questions to ask you, and I'm sure you could fill in the blanks as we go through. And everybody, feel free to drop things in the Q&A area if you have questions, or even in chat. Of course, I catch those, and I love to bring that stuff up. But I think the first thing that I want to start out with is basically your origin story and why do you specialize in story? What brought you there?
Well, thanks so much, Luis, for inviting me to participate. And the learning and development community is what I call the early adopters of stories. So you all are ahead of the curve. You get that. When learning transfer happens, it can go away within, 80 to 90% of your learning can go away within 24 hours if people are not attached to that message. And one of the best ways to do that is through story. So my story began about 4.5 years ago for Why Story Works, when I was working for a Fortune 500 company as in a lot of different ways. I think I had about 6 different roles with that company in the 4.5 years I was there, and working in L&D for about a dozen years. And they were outsourcing our department. And I said, well, it might be a good time to take my lovely severance package and my love of story and start on this journey with Why Story Works. So it was really a love of helping people tell their stories. And in the messages that I've been receiving from people over the years, I don't know about you all, but everybody has a story and everybody loves to tell stories and listen to stories. And sometimes it's really hard to deliver. So that's where I specialize in helping people tell the right story at the right time to the right audience to get the right results. And also bundling your story up in about 2 minutes or less, because the brain, John Medina, our lovely guy who wrote Brain Rules, I'm sure a lot of us out there in L&D understand that book. The brain does not pay attention to boring things. And the brain is hardwired for story. That's how we learn. That's how we grew. That's how we evolved as a species. It's because our brains were captivated and paying attention to the survival stories out there. So my survival story is really one of just loving storytelling, have a background in performance, have my own theater company for years. I've been in sales and management for years. I think I've sold everything there is to sell except maybe cars. And I thought, how wonderful would it be, instead of selling, let's say, a widget, what if we helped people sell their ideas or sell themselves or sell their company? And the best way to do that is through story.
So that's Yeah. No, that's great. And I'd see on your website too that I think it was when you were a child, you had narrated something like really early on, and that's kind of what got you addicted to it.
Yeah, I mean, my very first time telling stories, I was invited to be on stage to be the narrator in Goldilocks and the Three Bears by my first grade teacher, who said that I was chosen because I had the biggest mouth. So I got going, and I'm up there on stage. And the person who's playing Mama Bear is messing up her lines. She's not taking us upstairs to find Goldilocks. And I'm like, excuse me, she meant to say. And so I'm taking, so I stop the whole stage, and she's back there, she's got her little puppet thing. I'm the narrator, and she's crying because she feels embarrassed. But I'm thinking the show must go on. We got to get these people upstairs. And so when I got off stage, they're like, oh, you saved the day. You kept the story going. And I'm like, okay, I didn't even realize what I was doing. And I realized that, hey, this is kind of cool. I can figure out when a story is going sideways, or I can help get things back on track. And, eventually I got a degree in performance, and, I've written plays, and I've told stories at the Moth, and, I've been in sales and leadership and management. So that's the beginning of the story for me.
Wow, that's great. And sort of the common thread there is I do these showcases for TLDC where I love to interview TLDC members and just talk to them about their backgrounds. And a lot of it is like unrelated to L&D entirely, but I do see that common thread where somehow in their background, they had this opportunity to help educate somebody or share knowledge with someone. And it felt really, really good to them. Sort of the same way, yeah, the narration piece works for you.
Well, yeah. And, I also worked in the New York City public school system years ago, doing social issues outreach theater, using the art of story as a vehicle to promote social change and healing, and then making this leap to being a trainer seemed kind of like a no-brainer, right? But it's hard because people kind of want to get wrapped up in some of the details. They get lost in some of the details, and it's like, so what's the point, right? Sometimes, have you ever heard a story where you kind of want to poke your eyeballs out and you're like, where is this story going? How does this relate to me? So storytelling can be learned, and it's a craft. And those of us in L&D know to link our messages. If we can do, let's say, a story to exemplify it, it'll land a little better for our audience.
Is there what do you find that you typically have to help people with when it comes to story? Is there anything specific that really is sort of like, okay, this is generally what everybody needs help with?
Well, most people think, oh, I don't have any stories. I don't, there's nothing I have that's interesting, or I'm kind of boring, or, what do I have to add to the conversation? I'm like, oh my goodness, everybody has stories. It's just mining them and pulling them out. It's kind of like, a panhandler mining for gold. You've got these nuggets there, and you just got to let them percolate and come to the surface. And that takes self-reflection, and it also takes risk. You have to be willing to be vulnerable. I say, to avoid death by story, you have to be real, be relevant, and be brief. So
Is there now I'm going to put you on the spot here. Can you think of an example of somebody that didn't believe that they had a story to tell and then you found one?
Oh my goodness. Yes. I was working, with the shift of the pandemic there. One of the packages I offer on my website is job search optimization. And all of these interviews that people go through now are real-time interviews about what's your story, or how can you relate a story when you did something. And this VP of marketing was just like, well, I don't really have any stories. I don't really know. I'm like, oh, yes, you do. So it was really a matter of him kind of reflecting and looking back on where he's been and being able to put that in a package so that he was able to say, well, yes, my story is incredibly relevant here, and here's how. And I think a lot of times people forget, what's the point of the story? So, stories have a natural arc. They have a beginning, a middle, and an end. I mean, we've been telling stories for thousands and thousands of years. And I think sometimes we forget that our stories, when we're able to kind of package them up, if we know the emotion we're trying to activate, then we can kind of find that story and zing right in.
Wow.
I hope I answered your question there. I think I did.
No, I think you did. And it's funny because Julia in chat, she's saying real, relevant, and brief. And she says, I lack the brevity gene, and she's working on that.
Yes. We all do. I get sucked into it too. We love to hear the sound of our own voice. We just, go on and on and on. And I've got a real clean template on my website. You can look at it. It's the chunk outline, but it's how to tell a story in 2 minutes or less, basically.
Yeah. And I think that's
Yeah.
one of the biggest challenges, right? Because I know that myself, sometimes I love to tell a story, but then, it's almost for my own, enjoyment. I get into it, and I'm reliving it in my
Right.
mind.
Right.
And so it's fun for me, but maybe not for the people that are listening, because it could take so long.
Well, and that's the hard part, right? You've got to be able to, and that's also one of the things, if you have a story coach, or you have a coach, or you're working, let's say, to craft a new module, you've got to practice your stories. We can't just wing it. If you practice a formula, and there's a real clear formula if you want to tell a story in 2 minutes or less. You want me to tell you what it is?
Yes, please.
Okay. In the first 30 to 90 seconds, the first 10 to 30 seconds, you want to be in that moment. So in other words, where were you? What were you doing? So, I was 6 years old, and I'm on stage, and I'm the narrator in Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And the one who's playing Mama Bear is losing it. She doesn't know where she's going. And I'm thinking, so now that's the first, where were you? What were you doing? You got to set that up. Or you want to have your hook or your grabber. Sometimes people ask a question too. Like, have you ever listened to a story and you're thinking, I want to poke my eyeballs out. Where's the story going? You're like, yes. So you got to grab them first 30 seconds or so. And then you spend the rest 60 to 90 seconds talking about the conflict. In other words, there's a change that happens. There is what we call an inciting incident. Something kind of shifts the narrative. Think about Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. That's a classic story of rags to riches. He's, Charlie is just kind of moving along, and he's in the rabbit hole, like they don't have a lot of money, but then he finds a golden ticket. So now he's off to the races. So then you've got about 90 seconds or so to give some specifics about what happened. Then what happened? Then what happened? Then what happened? Until you get to your climax of then what finally happened. And then you spend the last 20 seconds say, so the point of the story is, or my advice to you is, or the next time you experience, you might want to try. So 20 to 30 seconds, where were you? What were you doing? Then something changes. So for the next 60 to 90 seconds or so, you give maybe 3 to 5 specifics about what was the conflict that you're overcoming. And then you spend the last 20 to 30 seconds telling us why it matters. In other words, what's the point?
Right. No, I love it. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah.
In fact, it kind of relates a little bit to the next question I'm going to ask you is, like, what do people get wrong or make mistakes about when they're using story in their learning? And for myself, a lot of times I think I focus too much on that 20 to 30 seconds, right? Of just that. But, is there anything that you can share with us about, like, what people typically, the kinds of mistakes people typically make?
Yeah. There's a phrase that goes, you never want to be the hero of your own story. And you might be thinking, well, Theresa, didn't you just tell me that, you want to be real, be relevant, be brief? Aren't I supposed to tell everybody what happened to me? And the question is yes. And you want to focus it on what your audience needs. So let me break that down. For example, I've spent a lot of time researching, and I've come up with this formula that there are 5 basic neurological responses inherent in any good story. And those neurological responses relate to what your audience needs. So I think sometimes as storytellers, we get so hung up in, oh, my story, this is what I'm doing. And we don't think about, where is my audience and where do I need to get them to? If you liken this to theater on some level, it's your motivation for the scene. Or when I coach people, especially in L&D, I had a gal who was doing a TED Talk. She was having a real hard time, super smart. And I said, what do you want your audience to think, feel, and or do differently? So again, it's not about me. It's where do I want my audience to go? And then I can craft my stories around that. And I've, that's really, and you got to engage emotion. So many times people have a very wonderful character, i.e., their protagonist or their hero or themselves, but they don't have a problem they're solving, or they're not solving a problem that the audience is dealing with. So again, the brain checks out because it doesn't pay attention to boring things, and they don't want to hear, everybody's listening to the same radio station.
Right.
right?
Ah,
WWIIFM. What's in it for me, right?
right. Exactly. So like, it sounds like you kind of work backwards a little bit, right?
Yes, and you have to think where you want to go. So again, that's a mistake people make. They get into this really great story, but it doesn't accomplish your objective.
Mhm,
So let's say in L&D, for example, if you've got a group of people that are starting a brand new job, let's just do onboarding.
mhm,
What are they feeling? They're probably feeling a lot of fear, a lot of
mhm,
anxiety, a lot of
mhm.
stress, right? So again, there are 5 key neurological responses. I tell people, if you want your audience to stay attuned to you and not to flee, fear, love, longing, empathy, and action. Those are the 5 neurological responses inherent in any good story. So if you know your audience is feeling a lot of fear, and they're going to have a hard time focusing. So you're going to need to you need to tell a story that's going to release cortisol. And you might think, well, gosh, isn't cortisol that fear response? The answer is yes. And it helps your audience focus. So if you know your audience is feeling a lot of fear, you might need to slow down. You might need to tell a story that helps them really hone in on maybe one thing so they don't get overwhelmed. And you want to guide them through so that they can just kind of calm down and pay attention. Otherwise, their brain is going to be going all over the place and they're not going to be able to land on what it is you're trying to instruct.
Wow. So basically, like in an onboarding situation, if somebody is coming in that might be a little fearful of this new change
Right.
and all of this and feeling that stress, you create kind of a package of something that might help them feel safety.
Yes.
Um, right.
Yes, absolutely. So again, when we think about these 5 neurological responses, we know that as humans, we've got the fear response. And so we got to get them feeling psychologically safe, right? So you're going to maybe build a lot of things into your learning that's going to help that safety and trust. And you're probably going to tell some stories where maybe people felt fear and that your solution helped them calm down, or you're going to maybe tell stories like, don't worry, we got you. We got this. We've been doing this for a while. Here's
Mhm.
your mentor. Here are the things here's your road to success. Here's what right's going to look like down the road. So again, you can kind of eliminate some of that.
Right.
And that's going to release the cortisol response, which is going to help them focus.
Right. Yeah. And it seems like that should be standard in onboarding is
Yes, yes,
probably come up
yes.
with.
Yes. And then, and we see this sometimes in sales with fear. They'll say, well, if you don't want to have the problem of everybody, returning your products or, never buying your product or whatever it is, you need to adopt my solution. So sometimes it can work both ways, but you want to release cortisol. But for love, let's say if you're thinking about love, that one is great because that's the release of dopamine. So if you know your audience is feeling, let's say, lonely, like we see a lot in the pandemic right now, you're going to want to release a story that is going to tap into dopamine. And dopamine is that neurochemical we get when, everyone's in our feeds and they're like, oh, she likes me. And you get all these likes. And dopamine only stays in the system for about 90 seconds.
Hmm.
So you want to continue maybe sprinkling in. So if you want your audience member to fall in love with, let's say, your company, you might want to sprinkle in some love stories along the way to release that dopamine. Another response is longing. If you know people are longing to belong or they're feeling stressed or overwhelmed, you want to release this. You want to tell a story that's going to maybe release serotonin, so people can calm down. It's kind of how I feel when I get a big bowl of pasta, right? So, um, and then there's the other one: fear, love, longing, empathy, right? So if we
Mhm,
know your audience wants to you want to relate to the audience, this
mhm.
is where CEOs might tell some stories that will release oxytocin, or sometimes they tell some stories where they're not as successful. So maybe as an L&D professional, you might tell some stories where you fell down or it didn't quite work out, or how, I'm just like you, I've been in your position. And then the last neurological response is action, or the release of adrenaline. So this is sometimes when you see at the end of, let's say, a sales meeting, or at the end of your L&D module, you're like, okay, so for next week, we're going to start on this. So you've got some intentional preparation and you want to release that adrenaline to get people excited to go forth and conquer. So.
Wow. So yeah, I just am so surprised to hear about story relating to biological responses. That's the first time that I've heard that.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of my secret sauce. You know, we always tell people in storytelling what makes you unique and different. And this is something that I've developed over the years by watching and listening and understanding that we've all got responses. And the amygdala, that's that part of the brain that says, pay attention. If we can hone in on that emotional response, then our story's going to stick. And that's what we want. We need sticky stories. It's not enough to have a story. We need it to stick. Yeah.
I love it. Okay. So we've been talking about stories kind of in relation to like building training, but
Yep.
if you are an individual, like say that right now within the TLDC audience, there are a lot of folks that are, moving from teachers to instructional designers or
Yeah.
looking for a new job, things like that.
Yep.
Choosing their story, that story to represent themselves or whatever their persona is, that can be kind of a challenge. Like, do you have any
Yeah.
suggestions on how to choose what is the right story for yourself?
Yes. So again, I like to say you can have story by the numbers 5, 6, 7, and then when you get 8, we're ready to go. We're off to the races. So there are 5 main neurological responses, but there are also 6 main story arcs. And the 6 arcs, within origin stories, you can decide. In fact, I'm running a series right now on my website, and the second arc is going to drop, I think, next week. And I put it on LinkedIn as well. But you got to think, what is the story arc for my brand or my company? What is it that I want to hang my hat on? And let's think about one simple story arc, rags to riches. And when you think about rags to riches, you can think about Amazon or think about Microsoft. They are those, they're what we call those garage band companies, right? Where they, Bill Gates in his garage, trying to figure out the solution. And then, oh, Eureka, he comes up with it. So it's a rags to riches kind of a story. Or you've got Amazon, who started in the garage selling books, and now look at Amazon. They're like the most wonderful, or not wonderful, whatever you want to use, but the biggest company worldwide. So that's a very simple story arc that tells some of their why or their beginnings. And so as you're thinking about what's your story or where do you want to hang your hat, what story arc are you following? Sometimes it's person in a hole. You're going along just fine, and then poof, something happens, and you're like down the rabbit hole, and you have to kind of claw your way out till you get to equilibrium. I'm reminded of everything that's happened with the pandemic. Through no fault of our own, we kind of got sideways, and then now I'm clawing my way out. So how does your solution help people get back to equilibrium? Again, it's all about the solution. So you got to think, where do I want my audience to go? What is my main secret sauce, for lack of a better word? And then how can my story illustrate it? The story is the example or the vehicle to get your audience where you want to go. And you absolutely need to reverse engineer it. Yeah.
Interesting. So it seems like the sort of the difference between the conflict and the resolution is probably what is most important if you want to accentuate being able to show that you're somebody that can resolve like a particular conflict. That's what makes the story, the most attractive, is having those kind of that sort of extreme activity.
Yes, and yes. So a story without conflict is just a great narrative. It's just a great narrative. And a narrative is nice. And a narrative is not a story. It's a narrative. It's a character exploration. So, for example, for you, Louise, you might think, why did I start TLDC? What was the big problem I was seeing out there? And you might say, I don't know. Why did you start TLDC? I mean, I can ask you the question, right? What was
Yeah, when I first started it was really more a thing where I loved building conferences, but I did not love building giant conferences. I didn't want to
Yep,
do like 2,000, 3,000 person conferences anymore. I wanted to do smaller ones, but I
right.
still love the activity of sharing knowledge and getting people together and all of that. And
So
so That's
So
why I
was there
started.
a specific, now I'm going to story coach you for a minute.
Yeah.
Was
Oh,
there, you probably did like, what is happening? Was there a specific eureka moment where things just changed for you? So what's your inciting incident? What happened? Where was that moment when you were like, this is what I must do with my life?
well, I think that it was really I had actually left my old job,
Yep.
and I wanted to take some time off because my son was born,
Okay.
and I needed to get some work-life balance, or maybe just life balance back. I wanted to start playing music again. But then
Uh-huh.
as I had taken that year off, I realized I really miss people. I really miss building this stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I really miss like bringing individuals together this way. I
Yep.
really want to get back to doing that, but do it in a way that fits my vision a little better. And that was
And
pretty much it.
yeah, and that vision, was there a moment when that vision really crystallized for you when someone said, "Oh, Luis, if you don't do this, I'm going to go do it. Or you better, you've really helped me."
Right. No, there were people like, for instance, Brent Schlenker, when we first started, he was
Yep.
somebody that was really encouraging, and he and I talked a lot about it. And Patty Shank, who is a friend of mine that we worked
Mm-hmm.
together, the three of us were kind of into that. And I was more of an operations person. And I'm like, yeah, I really want this to happen. And ultimately, when we did our first conference, I remember wrapping up, and it was a small event, about 110 people. And I, as Trish Yule had closed it, there were actually people in the audience crying, like, some of
Yes.
the attendees, because they felt so emotionally like,
There you
um,
go.
yeah.
That's
And,
it.
and I was like, this is it. This feels really, really good to me.
There you go. So you've done your now we've given you the conflict. So he's kind of reached his climax, everyone. So now you're going to say, so my advice to you is, so when the next time you're worried, or that's when I knew, so now land it. So now you got to stick the landing. What's the final message? What's your kind of aha that you want us to take away?
Oh, geez. Well, for me, that it's incredibly rewarding to do this and to bring people together, but it's not necessarily going to be what you initially planned. It's going to
Yeah.
all yeah, it's just going to be a work in progress all the time. But the goal for me is to still have that kind of that emotional release for people in the end, where they feel like that they've really benefited from something that I help facilitate.
Yeah, so there you go. So now, if we were going to make it really, see, I'm story coaching him right now, folks.
How
So
much am I going to
now,
owe you after this?
yeah, so now what he might say to stick the landing. So my advice to all of you and all of you L&D professionals, this is what I love to do. We've got to stick together. We've got to be connected, because when all of us are connected together and we have this forum where we can share ideas, oh my God, we can feel together, we can feel belonging, and we know that we're making a difference. And that's why I love TLDC,
Hmm.
right?
There you
Right?
go. Okay.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
great. Oh,
yeah.
thank you so much, Theresa.
So that's the power of story in your life, to get you to kind of get the audience to feel that motion. And for me, when you finally said, and there were people in the audience that were crying, and I realized that this is what I need to do with my life, that I'm in the right place, I'm in my lane. That's the aha moment. That's the reason for being or believing. And so you
Mhm.
want to people remember the beginnings and ends of things. So if your story is going all over the place, don't worry too much about it. Just make sure that you end strong, like Nadia Comaneci or Mary Lou Renton. You want to stick the landing.
Right. Right. And like Julia was saying earlier, just like keeping that brevity, because I know that sometimes, especially when I get into talking about something that I've experienced and sort of expressing it, I can definitely get a little long-winded with those things, with telling a
Well,
story.
yes, and there's a phrase I say a lot. Specific is terrific. So you want to be specific, but not too specific that you go on too long, right? So if you can keep your story to about 2 minutes, you can, know where you need to add and trim. And then you can always thread maybe 3 stories together to maybe have about a 9-minute bundle. And you don't, and again, John Medina says, you want to shift gears every 9 minutes or so. And that's why sometimes you'll see in conferences, and you probably are already doing this, people may shift their ideas or shift their topics about 10 minutes or so, 9 to 10 minutes or so. So if you bundle your stories together, maybe three-minute stories or 2-minute stories, then you can shift to something else.
Oh, that's
And you can
great.
thread them all together. Yeah.
Yeah, I'd heard that conversations typically go between like that 7 to 9 minute mark, and then
Yep.
there's always a pause,
Yep.
and then people come back to it. And I remember like when I was younger, we would like actually measure these things at parties and see like, did you see that? It really does work. It goes like
It does
7
work.
minutes.
And again, it's a neurochemical response, right? And so that amygdala has a limited attention span because the brain is kind of lazy. And I say that with all due respect, because we need to save our brain power for when we have to move into that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, or that stress response so that we can survive. So understanding some of the story neurochemical responses inherent in a story, understanding the basic story arcs, how you can bundle up a 2-minute story, all of these tactics will get you to that spot where you've got a story that really resonates.
Wow.
And then I tell people, you can throw all that out the window if you're telling a super engaging story. So it's kind of like Picasso, right? You've got all of these ideas around how to paint and draw that, study the masters. And then, if you're really in the zone of being incredibly authentic, it almost doesn't matter.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And I do want to talk about that authenticity piece. Like, why is it so important?
Well, people can suss out the fakeness. They get it. And if it means you have to be vulnerable, and vulnerability and you can buy anything, anywhere, anytime. There's so many things out there on the internet. There's so many L&D professionals. And if you're able to really embrace your vulnerability, your credibility shoots up and you stand out. Right? So you make a difference because of bringing your full self to the table. And that's a scary thing. That's a scary thing. But it's when we're really authentic that we can really resonate with the audience, because we're going to stand out. We're going to touch a nerve. We're going to share our humanity. And the brain just kind of lights up. I mean, it doesn't matter whether I'm telling us, that's my story. If I'm telling a story that's really authentically mine, your brain will react as if it's happening to you. It doesn't know the difference, the brain. It just is like, oh my God. And so then we learn. So if the story is too generic, or if it's not authentic enough, it's not going to resonate in the emotional centers of the brain. The amygdala or the hippocampus is going to say, yeah, that's nice, but that doesn't relate to me. So that's where you've got to really dig deep.
Right. No, I love that, because, those two terms that you just mentioned, vulnerability and sharing our humanity, when I think of in terms of, like, say, onboarding,
Yep.
right? A lot of times you will just get these onboarding things and it'll feel really robotic or just very sterile, the way that people are given entry into an organization. But if you actually put some of that humanity in there and that vulnerability, it just can be that much more effective, I would say.
It can be. And, onboarding journeys, you always think, what do you want people to do in the first 30, 60, 90 days? We hear that a lot, right? So it's that repetition piece where you got to practice it, right? So you also need some time to get there. You don't go to a party and all of a sudden start telling your darkest, deepest, secrets. So you have to build up that trust factor so that people can say, all right, I'm ready to hear this now. So again, you kind of have to gauge again. And there's a common theme here. It's about your audience. It's not about you. It's about your audience. And you've got to I coach people that you want to have, let's say you've got those 5 neurological responses, right? Fear, love, longing, empathy, and action. And I've got 5 fear stories. I've got 5 love stories. I've got 5 longing stories. You want to be able to pull those stories out like a card catalog, like, oh my God, my audience is feeling really, like I don't get it. Like just yesterday Wednesday, I was back doing an instructor-led training for one of my vendor partners. First time back in front of people in over a year. Wow. And I had somebody, and I'm sure those of us who are in L&D, who are facilitators, we had somebody in the room who was a curmudgeon. Do you know what I'm talking about? or she can derail your training in a New York minute. They're like, oh yeah, that, she's sitting there arms crossed. She was kind of one of those people that didn't want to participate in the activities. She's like, no, I don't want to share. I'm good. So all throughout this 3-hour training, she was on the sidelines. So now it's the last 20 minutes of my training, and I've got one more activity that I must do, and I'm running behind. And she's like, well, this is all good in theory, but when are we going to put this into practice? Okay, right? I'm sure you can relate. Mm-hmm. And I just said, all right, I know I've got to get through this last agenda item. And if I don't address this whole training is going to go down the drain. That's all there is to it. And so I just stopped, and I was just like, okay, I got to pull out a story here that talks about possibly the value or being really honest. And if you don't change, you might not have a job. And so I just kind of pretty much said, I get where you're coming from, and the onus is on us. Stuff happens, but it's our response to it. And I talked about a time when I had a pretty difficult direct report that was, and this is a customer service training I was doing. And I talked about how she was wanting to throw me under the bus, and she didn't want to listen to me. And I got called into the room with the VP and HR, and she left, and she was like, haha, I got you. And my VP turned to me and he says, oh, you want to know what they're saying. The danger comes when they don't tell you. And so I looked at the audience member. I'm like, thank you for telling me that you don't really like it, basically. And I said, and we've got some intentional preparation for you for next week that's going to actually force you to put this into practice in your work life. So I had to kind of step back instead of powering through my agenda and say, just wait, it's coming. I was like, oh, have that story ready to go. And I had to really think, what does this audience member need to hear right now? And it can't be about me and pushing through my agenda.
Wow. Great. Thank you for that example. That was really, really good. I think that people can definitely identify with that and can see why using story can be so important to communicate and help people understand certain concepts and all of that. Thank you.
You're welcome. And you had to have it ready to go, right? I had to have it in my repertoire. I had to have it in my file folder to pull out. So that's where that practice comes into play, and mining your stories. And that's where people don't really remember them. So if you've got a place that say, here are my fear, my love, my longing, my empathy, my action stories, and think about my audience. So I had to pull up all of my customer service stories and kind of do a card catalog before that training as an athlete to get myself ready for that training. I had to make sure I had stories that were going to be relevant for them.
Yeah. So basically just having an index of these types of things can be really helpful.
And speaking of timing, you have to be able to tell the stories sometimes in 20 seconds, in 1 minute, or in, 6 minutes or 9 minutes. So if you've got more time, you can go a little deeper. So you've got to really understand what's the main point. And again, this comes from practicing, right? You can learn it. It's a discipline and a skill, but you do need to practice.
Well, and one of the last questions that Kim had asked in the Q&A area is, how do we know how long a story should be in a particular context? Are there rules of thumb?
Well, again, I usually try to keep my stories, especially for new people who are starting out with storytelling, 90 seconds to 2 minutes. Be real, be relevant, be brief. So once you get more buy-in, you can make your stories maybe a little longer, or especially if you're really intimate and people are really engaged, but you got to be able to read the room, right? But again, really good rule of thumb, 90 seconds to 2 minutes for one specific story. And then you could go back to that story maybe later with more detail, but about 2 minutes or so.
Nice. All right. Kim's following up with asking, do you have any insights about using stories that are not your own, crafting third-person stories or fictional stories based on real life?
Yeah, that's where reading really comes into play. I'm an avid reader. I read all the time. So for those of us in L&D, we're going to read a lot of books maybe around, like I love Dan Pink's book, Drive. I love Malcolm Gladwell. I've just finished reading and of course, John Medina, we talked about that, but I love reading, Dale Carnegie. I'm also a certified Dale Carnegie instructor. And, so finding some of those resources that will resonate with your audience so that you can show some of your credibility. Like when I teach on the Microsoft campus, I make sure that I've read Satya Mandela's book, who is the CEO of Microsoft, Set Reset. So you want to think about, where's your audience and what books or papers or thought leaders are they following? And maybe pull up a story around that person. Like we know Simon Sinek, he says, you got to know your why. And so referencing some other people's stories that might be relatable to your audience. I just finished reading Elizabeth Gilbert's Big Magic, and she talks a lot about how when we're finding our voice or finding those moments that matter, we can give a spot for, let's say, what stops us, right? Fear, right? So she says, fear and creativity go on a road trip with you. And you're driving and creativity is sitting in the driver's seat and fear is there. He's in the back seat. But fear absolutely does not get to vote on where we go, and they don't get to change the radio station, and they certainly don't get to drive. Yeah. So if you're, working on crafting or finding a new solution, let's say as a learning development designer, you're going to have those elements of creativity and fear, and you being the driver, but don't succumb and let fear take over. Mm-hmm. So there's a quick sample I just gave you of a third-party story that's relatable to the audience, but it's not my story.
Right. No, very nice. Well done, Theresa.
My pleasure. You got to be able to think on your feet, right?
Right.
But again, the main thing, if you put in a lot into your bank by reading and practicing and teaching and learning, and you've mined it, and you know those 5 neurological responses, then you know which story to pull out when.
Nice. All right, I'm going to ask you one last question.
Okay.
What inspires you as a storyteller?
Seeing people feel confident enough to share their stories and living in alignment. So I'm going to tell you one final story, okay? It was St. Patrick's Day, 2016. And I get a call from my sister who's living in New York City, and I'm in Seattle. And she says, I have gone to the St. Patrick's Day parade every single year for the past 17 years, and I'm not going to miss this one. And what you all need to realize is that my sister is in month 8 of a 9-month colon cancer diagnosis. And I said, okay, that's it. I'm getting on a plane. My daughters and I, we got on a plane and we were in her apartment within 24 hours. And she's got noisemakers and party makers. And we get to the parade and the band is playing and the trumpets are blaring. And she looks at me and she says, this is the best day of my life. And I said, God, it probably was. And later that night, she said, what a wasted life I led, failing at things just to piss off mom and dad. Don't you do that. Don't you do that to your daughters, and don't you do that to yourself. And within, 6 weeks, she was gone. And her 5-year anniversary is on May 3rd. It's coming up. And so I tell you that story because it was at that moment that I realized, if not now, then when? I love listening to stories. I love hearing people's stories. And if you're living in alignment with the story that you're meant to tell, let's say as L&D professionals, you've got this gift to create dynamic training, do it. Don't stop. Don't live with regrets. And that's why I love story, because it has the power to move mountains. It has the power to change on a dime. And it was at that moment, really, that I decided I'm going to move to really helping people tell their stories and telling my own.
Wow. Theresa, thank you so much. That's wonderful. It's really wonderful. I really appreciate that. All right. Well,
I know. Right? What do you do with that? Right? But see how that was a sample of a story? That exemplified your question, that kind of helped you understand my why. And I've told that story so many times that It's not, it's real for me and it's relevant, but I'm not crying on the floor around it, right?
Right,
So you
right,
don't want your audience to be your therapist. You need to be confident and real enough within your stories and have a handle on them so that when you're called to pull them out, I had no idea I was going to tell you that story,
right.
but it's one that I've told enough that I think might help move the audience to understand the power of story.
And there it is. Theresa, thank you so much. Thanks
Oh,
for sharing your Friday with us.
my
I'm so glad
pleasure.
you get to participate. You're gonna have a booth at on Community Day.
Yep.
Why Story Works. You're gonna be in the expo area. So everyone, please, if you log into Community Day, make sure you stop by Theresa's booth and check out what's going on in there. And I'm sure, Theresa, please make sure that you pop in and hang out in sessions and all of that, because we'd love
Absolutely.
to have you there.
Absolutely. I will be there. And if anybody who's listening to this story session right now or comes by the booth, anybody that comes by, I will give you 100% a free 30-minute story crafting session. So all you have to do is say, I was there, and I will work with you for free for 30 minutes. So that's my story gift to you. You just have to say I was there. So you can find me at Theresa at whystoryworks.com, www.whystoryworks.com. So I am here to help you tell your stories, because I really believe that everybody has a story. It just needs coaxing to the surface.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Theresa. I just posted the link to whystoryworks.com. And everyone, we'll see you next week. I actually have on Monday, Jamie Villanueva is going to be in. He's an instructional designer that kind of built a tool on how to build a portfolio. So join us on Monday if you're interested in that. And with that, have a great weekend, you guys. And thanks again,
And
Theresa.
keep telling your stories to other people. We need our stories now more than ever. That's why story works.
I love it. I love it. All right. Thanks,
All right.
everyone.
Thanks,
Take
Louis.
care.